Hello, everyone, and welcome to Elevated, the monthly podcast from Caltech Center for Technology and Management Education, where we uncover insights from industry leaders and explore their journeys in project management and beyond. I'm Jen Garcia, your new host and an AI tools instructor here at Caltech CTME. In my career, I've managed multiple projects, and I'm passionate about bringing innovative tools and strategies to the business sector. And today, I have the privilege of interviewing Jane Urban, who's not only a trailblazer in healthcare analytics and commercial pharma strategy, but she also brings a unique and innovative servant leader approach to her leadership. And I'm so excited to have this interview with her today. We'll dive into her experiences, lessons she's learned, and the future of data in biopharma. Jane, I'm delighted to have you on Elevated. Let's first start with hearing a bit about you and then about how you started this journey into data. And from there, we'll have our conversation.
Thanks, Jen. I'm so honored to be part of this first episode that you're hosting and just part of the Elevated podcast in general. It's such an honor. For me, I think that the notion of project management is really core to getting anything done. Like when you talk about trying to make something happen and be real, that's the core underpinnings of all of it to be able to have it be real. So I think project management is almost so embedded for me at this point that I don't quite think of it as a separate thing, but I think it's such an important part of the focus of what you all are working on and trying to learn. My background for the most part is actually in engineering and data, kind of starting out early in my career. I was working with a bunch of different kinds of data, specifically actually in the healthcare space. It was the Medicare and Medicaid database, which is a publicly available data set that's huge and it's really fun to play with. And a lot of folks I know use that as a place to kind of experiment and look at data. But more importantly, when you think about it from the lens of project management, it's about what are we trying to learn or what kind of questions are we trying to answer? And then how can the data support the ability for us to answer that question one way or another? And so kind of looking with what the end of the whole project is supposed to yield, and then backing up and saying, okay, what are all the pieces of that have to come together? So throughout my career, I've gotten a chance to work on a lot of different problems of that ilk. I've luckily worked both as a practitioner inside of a pharmaceutical company, manufacturing company, as well as a consultant supporting different kinds of projects that a pharma company might want to do. And so that's actually been, I think, a big part of my whole career really is the components of coming up with a project, breaking it into pieces, putting it back together again, and then hopefully yielding some really great results. So I think it's actually very much applicable to a lot of domains, but for me, it's been in data and now actually most recently in AI. So it's kind of this interesting worlds colliding.
Fantastic. And tell me, what were there key decisions in your career that significantly influenced your career trajectory as you got to the space that you're in now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I am super lucky that I fell into this space that I'm in really when I was like 21 years old. I was a summer intern at Amgen out in Thousand Oaks, California, and I got to work on learning how to code in the DOS mainframe because I guess I'm getting to be something of a dinosaur when it comes to code. But working on projects to understand the outcomes patients would have using different types of combinations of therapy. And that the idea that I could take data and I could use it to answer a really important question that might actually help somebody be healthier or live longer. I mean, that just was, and I could get paid to do that. And that was like a job that I could do on a regular basis all the time. Like it was just sort of like that can't possibly be a real thing. And so I was just so excited. I had planned to actually do engineering undergrad and then go to law school and become kind of a patent attorney. That was my original arc that I had sort of set in motion. And it seemed like a good logical plan, right? Combining science and law. And I really, everyone always joked that I argued a lot as a kid, so I should be a good lawyer. So I thought that that would be the answer. But I got very lucky, and this is something I advise everyone to do. I told my boss while I was at Amgen that I wanted to be a patent attorney. And so he said, okay, let me see if I can get you time with some of the patent attorneys here at Amgen. And Amgen has some pretty top-notch patent attorneys. So this was these are some of the best people in this space. And I found that a lot of the work they did was very quiet, it was very isolated. They would sit for hours thinking about how to write these really clever patents. And it just wasn't at all what I expected. And I realized pretty quickly that was not what I wanted to be when I grew up anymore. So this really interesting summer where I went from definitely letting go of the original plan that I had had for several years and definitely picking up this whole other arc of what I wanted to be when I grew up all in one summer. It was just like an incredible kind of turning point for me.
Wow.
And then to kind of pursue it with this excitement and passion. And then it's taken me, on a wonderful journey ever since. I mean, I went into consulting first, as a lot of folks do right out of college. And then I got the opportunity to work in a pharma company not too long after that. And then kind of have been, on this wonderful arc of using data and analytics for 20 years now. And I think what's so funny is when I was first doing analytics and trying to come up with projects, I was doing both primary market research types of projects where you have, a bunch of things you want to learn about your customers, and then you set out with a survey and you ask them, or you do like a focus group and you talk to them, whatever that looks like, and then you answer the question. Like that was kind of a nice process flow. But all of that stuff was kind of seen as not that important. Like marketing is about, with your gut and like just guessing really well at what people might want and kind of coming up with these ad campaigns and things like that. So it had changed quite a bit over the arc of my career, that those things used to be pretty simplistic and kind of minor players in the decision-making process. And slowly but surely, data and AI and the technology that kind of facilitates using those things has really become much more prominent. People really look and say, this is important. I need this. I need people with those skills. So in some ways, for me, it was just a little bit of luck rather than skill, that I just got into a thing that I thought was amazing, but most people didn't really care about. And then all of a sudden, in the last, I would say it was about 3 years ago, that I was at Thanksgiving and my family was asking me, hey, I heard this AI stuff is like a thing. Do you know anything about that? Do you work? I feel like you do something with data. Like no one ever really knows what I do, but they're kind of like asking me questions. So for the first time at family Thanksgiving, it was like, what do you do again? So I think that's the mark of how much the data space and the sort of way that you can use data to answer questions has evolved over the last
Absolutely.
bit.
Absolutely. I was going to say that don't worry about being an MS-DOS girl. I was an MS-DOS baby. And so, we humble beginnings, but going into code in that way is fantastic because we know what it's like from the beginning. I was also going to say how fantastic that mentor, that supervisor at Amgen was able to give you access
Yes.
to explore and to get to know that you did not want to go that direction. And knowing what I know of you and the research I've done of you so far, that would have been a really a theft from all of us who enjoy listening to you speak and the various things that you're doing in allowing others to understand how data and leadership come together. And actually, this leads to my next question. What specific aspects in pharmaceutical leadership do you see fundamentally changing in the next decade because of data analytics and moving away from the gut and now into data?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting pattern that I've started to pick up on over the last few years, and I have a feeling it's going to continue and maybe even accelerate with some of the advent of AI and the other technologies that are coming. I think for me, what I've noticed is historically in pharma, a lot of the talented, wonderful people that lead are folks who started out as sales reps, because that used to be a really easy on-ramp. People were hired usually kind of right out of college or right out of grad school to be working in a field-based sales role. And so they would do that for a few years. If they were really good and they excelled, they'd end up getting an opportunity to maybe lead some people doing that. And then eventually come and do something in the sort of quote unquote home office, where you would work in, say, marketing or something or sales training or something kind of in that space. And so the background of a lot of the senior leaders today is some hybrid of marketing and sales. And they've kind of bounced between those two. And they have some breadth. I mean, some folks have worked in market access and tried to deal with kind of the notion of how to get the drugs paid for and things like that. So there's this like, but it's very commercial. It's just really those two kind of areas of sales and marketing. And my hunch is over time, the role that data has played used to be, again, very much kind of a side dish and something, if we had it, that's nice. If not, we'll make a decision, we'll figure it out. To really, especially with the advent of digital marketing, the marketing role has become almost like an analytical role. And so the folks who are really coming into leadership today, or who are coming up through the ranks as newer members of the pharmaceutical teams, their backgrounds tend to be a little bit more focused on data and analytics and using those things to drive their decision making. And so as you look at these new tools around next best action or next best engagement, suggestions, all of that sort of stuff, it lends itself to having to use and understand data more and more. So my hunch is over time, the senior leadership will start to evolve to include that more breadth of, variety of things, including data and analytics. And frankly, some of that project management skill set will become also really a big part of that as well. I think sometimes when you're doing the selling, you have a plan, but it's maybe not the same depth and breadth of stakeholders you need to involve as you might if you're doing some kind of a complex project. So to me, there's this neat combination of more variety of experiences in the leadership layer, and also the idea that leadership itself is a skill. Because a lot of times folks don't have a lot of formalized leadership training, even as they get pretty senior into the organization. I remember working with a second line sales leader who kind of asked me, like, I've never really been trained in how to do this. I was just good at being a sales rep. And so they promoted me. And then I was good at leading some sales reps. So they promoted me again. I don't know. I think a lot of it was sort of innate and sort of, hunches around what to do and what not to do and experience from doing it. But getting people leadership training and understanding of what it means to lead to me is, I spend a lot of time reading about this. It's kind of my hobby to read books about behavioral science and leadership. But I think it's a separate skill set that needs to be nurtured and developed in leaders. And ideally, at its maybe peak, you could lead really anything, even if you don't know as much about the details of how the inner workings work. You could still lead people doing that work. That to me would be the signal that they've separated and become separate skills from just strictly a domain expertise or something like that. So I think there's probably a couple different facets of how leadership will evolve. And perhaps in some ways, the AI and the data and the things that are happening and the sort of trends that are happening with using AI to create content or to basically help you advise on what to do, those pieces will make it ever more important that people who are leaders can be kind of in that role, because I think that's still going to be really hard for AI to do, to like lead other people and motivate them and inspire them. I think that's still going to be a domain for a long time that's squarely in the human realm to get right.
And that's absolutely correct. And, wasn't something that we were going to talk about, but I'm curious, in your research on leadership and your personal experience, what are some of the favorite qualities that leaders around you have had that have really impressed you and made you want to continue working with them and maybe even continue working with them at another season in the future?
Yeah, I think the first one that I would hone in on is really the idea that a really great leader will understand you well enough to see a version of you that's like maybe your next iteration. They can kind of picture you ahead of where you picture yourself. And so if you can work for someone who has that vision of you and not only knows that you're going to be like that you are awesome, but you're going to be even more awesome, and here's how and why, that to me is what is the sort of unlocker for all the energy to try to achieve that aspiration of leadership or as of whatever it is, better skills, better talent. The other thing is, I think really great leaders, and I aspire to do this myself. It's really not about you. It's about the people that you're leading and their needs and their, interests. And it sounds really simplistic, but if you know what matters to your people and you kind of anchor that understanding in how you talk about what's going well, what needs to change, what could be better, all of that is oriented toward what matters to that person, then you can really unlock a whole other kind of gear, I would call it, of that person because of that skill. So when I've had leaders that are willing to listen and understand what I care about, what motivates me, and they kind of connect with me as a human, and then use that as their motivator, kind of their carrot to be like, I know you really want to, have more experience doing this. So if you're able to attend this meeting, you should get some exposure to that, and that'll help you, whatever it is, like that kind of a conversation, as opposed to just like, I need you to go to this meeting, and you're like, oh, okay, I'll go to the meeting. Like, I don't know why I'm going to the meeting. It didn't occur to me that I would benefit from it per se. Like that kind of disconnect can be really, it's sort of next level of motivation and empowerment of an employee. And so to me, those are some of the things that really, really make a huge difference. And then as I've gotten to leading bigger groups of people, so it's one thing when you're leading like 5 or 6 people and they're directly reporting into you. As I've moved into this, like where I have layers of people under me, and I'm kind of in that, I don't get to know deeply that what motivates each individual person. So you're going to have to be more generic, I guess, in your advice and your guidance. That's where I think the biggest leadership jumps come, because you have to kind of, I call it like setting the weather. So you're sort of setting an environment for people to achieve. And obviously the folks well, perhaps the people that report into you, maybe the people report into them, you can do that motivational specificity. But in general, I think a lot of what I try to do is just bring this just optimistic, forward-moving kind of energy to the room, to the people that I'm leading, so that they hopefully feel some of that, like, this is possible, this is going to happen, this is going to work. And that is half the battle because if you believe it'll work and you believe it doesn't going to work, you're going to be right either way. So better to believe it's going to work and kind of work toward that success. So those are some of the components, but it's sometimes it's a mix of all of those, right? At different times and different points.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love, and especially, with managing large and small projects, setting the weather is so important. And as you mentioned, considering each stakeholders, what's important to them, what they're concerned about, and having that as a part of the project is so important to have successful projects ultimately. I love that. Thank you so much. And speaking of of navigating with big groups and all that. You in our conversation a few weeks ago, you mentioned you're like a translator between technical and commercial teams. And can you share more about the challenges and successes of that role and how you go about doing that as a leader?
Yeah, and I think the translation piece is a project management piece too, right? Like how do you translate the different languages that the different stakeholders in your project team speak? Some of them are pretty easy, some of them are pretty different. And so trying to figure out how to bridge those together. And I think for me, I've kind of made a whole career out of being very much comfortable in the techie world and as an engineer, like being, very open to people having different working styles. I had a data scientist who was often would work really late at night and send things, 2 or 3 in the morning and then be kind of sleeping during the morning and then come back online maybe in the afternoon. And that's just how he worked best and how he was most productive. And so those kind of things, like I think being comfortable with some of that variety of working style, but then
Right.
realizing that there's a 9 a.m. meeting tomorrow with executives and they're not going to be okay with this person sleeping through the meeting. How do you balance and kind of translate for them like what's happening and why it matters? Or maybe you end up having to represent the person who isn't able to attend for whatever reason, like those kinds of choices that you have to make around translation, maybe in a very literal sense. But I think the other piece is just listening and understanding. It goes back to the same leadership behaviors. What are the motivations? What matters to this person? What are they trying to tell me about what's happening in the project or what's happening in their kind of challenge? Usually people are coming to you because something's behind or something's not working the way they expected. And so they want to bring it to the project management attention, hopefully, if they feel safe enough to do so. And so how do you kind of make sure you understand the impact and the repercussions of that delay or that change for everybody else? And so that's where you get into that translation piece of saying, okay, so this technology is not working the way we're expecting. That means that what? Maybe it looks different to the end user, or the features that we were hoping for won't be available until the next time we release a new update, or whatever the sort of implications are. And getting that technical jargony part maybe around sort of something's not syncing or whatever it is to kind of what it's going to feel like and look like for an end user who maybe definitely doesn't want to hear about all the details of how that happened or why it happened, but just wants to know, when am I going to get my feature that I asked for? When is this going to be available? When is it going to be fixed? Whatever the thing is. And I think certainly in the notion when something breaks, which happens all the time, how do we fix it? How do we make sure that we don't break it in that unique way again? I'm always joking, like we're going to continue to make lots of creative mistakes in the course of working on a project, but let's do our darndest not to make the exact same mistake again, because hopefully we learned something from what happened and we've put some sort of mitigation in place to pick, ways to avoid that particular mistake and then make new and exciting mistakes. Like try to frame it as more of a positive. Because I do think that translation also involves trust. People saying, you know what, I guess you're doing your best. I'm going to do my best. We're both going to sort of come to the table and make sure that we're figuring it out, as opposed to they always mess things up and I don't know why they're always so behind and they, right? That kind of language. So as a project manager, you're kind of helping to almost be the therapist, right? For the drama between different groups of folks who might not always trust each other, frankly, is usually what it comes down to at the end of the day. That trust the positive intent, that, the fact that this isn't happening isn't a purposeful attempt to mess up something later down the project line, but it's actually just something that happened and we're going to figure it out. So I think that's a lot of it, is that kind of thinking about what are the motivations again, and what are the things that slow down or cause problems, and how do we bring those quickly to the table and learn about them, and then figure out how much of what the details are is actually relevant to the next stakeholder who might want to just know, maybe it's just the timing, like, oh, it'll be ready on Tuesday next week. Okay. And that's all they really, all the other stuff about how and why, I don't want to know. Like that's, I think, part of the role is what not to tell back and
Right,
forth.
right.
And also the other way around, like if they're really upset, maybe you don't share all of that with your tech person, because that's just going to put more pressure on them and make them more anxious. And might be better to just be like, they understand the new timeline, and then kind of move on from there. So that's a lot of the role in my mind at the nitty-gritty of it. But it is about that same thought process. What is going to matter? What's motivational? What's demotivating? How do we build more trust amongst everybody so that we don't have or we can minimize kind of the emotion of it all and keep it kind of focused on the problem we're solving.
Right, right. And it's interesting in regards to trust and motivation in relation to bringing in a new AI tools. I heard you run wonderfully translate the effectiveness of using AI tools in another interview that you did, wherein someone brought in the concern of if we're introducing new AI tools, how is this going to affect jobs within the workflow of biopharma, and obviously that's a true concern for many people, and you so eloquently explained the effectiveness of using AI tools and how it was going to really supercharge the flow. Could you talk more about that? I loved your
Yeah,
response
I
with
thought it was
that.
a really interesting kind of. I was at the conference I was at most recently. There was this. Well, what would just get rid of all the sales reps? Why would we ever have like? Why would we even need in-person salespeople? And my immediate reaction was no. I think we absolutely still need that role because so much of how humans process and think and deal with things is still going to be human to human, and they're going to want a human in that conversation. Now, there could absolutely be other things that it turns out we didn't need humans for, and so that's where there is some, I think, angst because, like, well, what if a human was doing that work and now they don't need to? So the biggest thing in my mind is how do we find other things for those folks to be working on that are still human centric or human kind of management of AI, as opposed to saying, well, we just can, get rid of all these people. And so that's a big part of the transition. It's very legitimately scary. And I think of over time, this has been a reality for a lot of different technical kind of or if you think the one I always use, I think it's a great metaphor, or just picture if any of you have worked in a early email era of work, which some of you may not have, but I'll just tell the story. Basically, there was a person who would push this little cart around the office, and they'd have these little envelopes that were like yellow, and had a little red string that kind of held them shut, and you would write down where you wanted this paper that was in the envelope to go elsewhere in the building. So if you worked in a bigger building, you might be like, I work on the third floor. This needs to go down to the first floor, and you'd write down the number of the room you wanted it to go to and who, and then you'd put it in that cart, and the cart person would take it and bring it down in the elevator and bring it to the first floor and give it to that other person. Obviously, at some point, email pretty much obliterated that need, right? Because there weren't that many things. We used to have to literally physically sign stuff. So a lot of it was about getting a signature, which you couldn't do digitally at the time. Now, of course, we can totally do digital signatures, but all of that stuff, that person who was driving the cart, right? Their job is absolutely gone, right? There's nobody driving around carts anymore. And that wouldn't make sense. And it just feels like, whoa, what are we talking about? However, that person who drove the cart, maybe they got into managing email servers, or maybe they were kind of helping make sure that the physical mail that does need to still be shipped, like packages and whatever, that's still their kind of role. They're focused on the mailroom and sending and receiving physical things or whatever, right? There's still a component. So I think it's just thinking about, yes, some jobs, absolutely, let's own it. That particular job doesn't make sense anymore in the context of AI. Maybe it is something like scheduling meetings. I think that's one of the ones I could see. I hope, honestly, the amount of back and forth you spend, like, when are you free? You free at 10? What time zone is that? Like all of that. So could AI fix that? Probably. And it seems like a pretty straightforward set of parameters. But is there still a need for a calendar management partner in crime in some cases, right? Because it's like, well, I could be meeting with Jen, but I also have this other really important person that asked me if I was available, and we got to figure this out. Maybe Jen, if you meet an hour later, could I still meet with this other person? Like that part AI would really struggle with, I think, because it'd be like, how do you know who's more important or what's more urgent or whatever? So every scenario I can think of, you're going to find some components that don't make sense to have humans do, but you're also still going to find some components where humans make a world of difference. I think the scale is where things might be different, right? So if you currently have 100 people doing a thing, maybe you either do a bunch more of that thing with the same 100 people, or you end up with a place where you need fewer people to do that particular thing because you have, AI to help support it. And then those folks are going to have to find another thing to work on. And so that's maybe a better way to think about it than just like all the jobs are going away instantly. But I would encourage everybody. It's just like people who decided to hold out on email probably were regretting that decision because it really boxed them out of a lot of things. Holding out on using AI is probably the same thing. Like if you're just like, I won't use this, I don't want to touch it, it's not something I'm interested in, there's very much a risk in that case that you're kind of going to get missed or lapped by other folks who do take the time to learn AI tools and take the time to figure out how AI can be embedded into project management and where it can accelerate steps that used to take hours could take seconds, right? Those kinds of time savings could really put a project manager in a place where they could manage more projects, let's say. And so they used to do 2 projects, they could manage 5. And so now that person is just that much more valuable to the organization than someone who's still doing everything manually. So it's going to be more like that, I think, over time. But there's going to still be components of pretty much everything we do that we're still not ready to completely abandon a physical presence of a human involved in it. And I do think that it's going to be more about interacting with other humans, right?
Mhm.
So that's going to be a big part of the skill sets that I think are more critical or more evolving to be much more important for people as they move into whatever career path they're moving into.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Shifting into your work predicting treatment escalations, back to biopharma, could you share more about your work in predicting treatment escalations or diagnosing undiagnosed patients? What was unique about the data techniques that you used, and what advice would you have with that type of predictions?
Yeah, I think so. That's some of the probably my proudest moments as a pharma data practitioner in my career has been using data to help predict both patients who maybe are undiagnosed with some sort of a rare condition that might have a kind of a constellation of different symptoms that make it difficult for a physician who hasn't kind of seen it before to identify what it is. The other category I worked on for a couple of years was really around patients who are diagnosed, but their treatment isn't fully meeting kind of their need as a kind of they have too many symptoms, too many sort of they're going to the emergency room on a regular basis, things like that that kind of indicate it's not quite right. They need more. They should sort of not settle for a poor outcome. They should be fighting to get maybe more treatment or better treatment or just different treatment because it's not working for them. And that happens so often, I think, in the healthcare space where people they get diagnosed, they get a treatment, and they kind of are like, I guess this is it. This is as good as it's going to be. And so
Mhm.
helping to kind of educate to say, well, there are other options. There are maybe different ways to escalate treatment to be more hopefully holistic and comprehensive in solving the problem rather than just treating one-off symptoms of your problem. So and my passion, I think, comes from just an experience myself with dealing with chronic disease. I have IBS, which is nowhere near as severe as some of the other things out there, but it's sort of a catch-all of like, we don't know what's wrong with your digestive system, so we give you this diagnosis. And so I think that gave me a lot more motivation to start thinking through these problems from that lens of a patient experience. So for me, the first project I worked on was really about kind of identifying the symptomology of a rare disease. And that's where you do have to partner with medical folks who have treated it, who have seen it. And they're typically more likely to be in a bigger academic medical center, and they've got, just the funnel of patients they're seeing, and odds of a disease that's really rare showing up on their doorstep goes up just because of the way that the kind of referral patterns happen.
Right.
And then using that information to say, okay, are there other people who don't have a diagnosis but have a lot of the same symptomology? And so that's where, again, you need that kind of medical collaboration with the data. And a lot of the data you're using in these cases, it's not so dissimilar to the stuff I was using way back at the beginning of my career. You have a patient kind of longitudinally, different things that have happened to them with the same patient ID. So if they've gotten diagnosed with something, then there could be treatment or intervention or a hospital visit or an ER visit or all these things that are happening over time. And you're kind of putting together the sort of timeline of different events that have happened to this individual patient. You don't know their
Mhm.
name. You may know some of their demographics. But one of our big things in data is, of course, the privacy of keeping patients anonymized. And so it typically is, trying to keep as much of the specifics that would help you actually identify who it is to a minimum. And so in some cases, we might say that instead of doing a specific age, we might do an age group, like they're between 18 and 25 or something as opposed to 19 years old. Like those sorts of things help kind of de-identify people. So we have this data set, we have these different symptoms, and then you're trying to hone in on people that look awfully similar to people who've been diagnosed. So it's kind of that comparison. And this is not really advanced AI or anything like that. This has been around. These statistical modeling techniques are tried and true. But I think applying them to this kind of data is a little bit different and trying to use that to help you sort of see where there are patterns that look and kind of feel like someone who already has a diagnosis. And so one of the projects I had done several years ago was in that realm. And it was one of the most fulfilling things to see that we were able to both come up with patients who look like they might have this disease. And then at the time, this was a disease that had maybe 1,000 people diagnosed in the country. So
Wow.
super rare. And so to be able to find, I think we found about 50 more people that we thought looked awfully likely to have this disease. And I remembered we were sitting in a conference room talking about this data and the results, kind of sharing it out with the commercial team and saying, no, we think we found these 50 additional folks. And it was 50 people, but there were 49 physicians associated with those 50 people. And so that was kind of like, I wonder what's going on. And it turned out there was one physician that had two people associated with their
Wow.
practice. And so we started there because right at that point, it's like, this could be really exciting if we can find two people. And so I remember the head of our medical and sales kind of leaders, field-based folks kind of calling and saying, if anybody know this doctor, could you get in there and talk to him? And within about a week, they had managed to get a hold of this physician, and it was in a more rural area. So again, kind of far away from anyone who might have seen this before. And
Wow.
the physician was like, I do remember these folks with these different kind of disparate symptoms. Let me get talking to them. And within a couple months, I think we had found out that it was brothers that both had this, genetic disease. And
Mhm.
the fact that they ultimately got on therapy and they were able to start having relief, just was such a, I mean, I'm so proud of the fact that data kind of made that happen and that you could use data to truly impact someone's life. So they go from kind of mystery illness to diagnosis to treatment in a matter of months, with data, which I think is one of the more fulfilling projects I've ever worked on. And the whole team, was just ecstatic. And this was a little bit simpler because it's a rare disease. There's only one treatment for it. So the ethics get very simple in that regard. But even if it's a disease state where there's multiple options, I think just getting someone to diagnosis and then letting their doctor work with them to choose what's the best next thing for them to do is already so much better than them sitting in that mysterious kind of, something's wrong, but you don't know what it is feeling, which for a lot of rare diseases, you could sit with that feeling for decades. I mean, it's really
Mm.
scary how long people struggle with symptoms that are not, it's just, that isn't it. I mean, I tried taking this product, it didn't do much for me, back to trying something else. It's really a tough road. So that for me was one of the more just fulfilling projects. And that notion of what are we trying to solve for? How do we put it all together and break it into some pieces? How do we collaborate with the right knowledgeable stakeholders to make sure that we're getting it, closer to reality with medical kind of guidance and then building a model that could help us get to an answer. It's really cool.
Wow, wow, that is amazing. And I dealt with walking my with my mom along her cancer diagnosis and her journey. And when she was, unfortunately, we lost her when she was 48, and her cancer metastasized from breast cancer to liver cancer. And during that time, she was so willing to share her data with various surveys that were going on to hopefully find a cure, for, if not for herself, for others. Do you find as technology has advanced that there is more of an openness for patients to share their data or not? I'm also good friends with a doctor that's working on making data and digital access more available to communities that usually don't want to access those digital services for mistrust and various reasons. Do you find that that tide is changing? And what have you found in
No,
that regard?
it varies. I don't think there's a like I wouldn't be able to say for sure it's one way or the other. I think there's pockets of each, right? There's pockets of people, and especially in the rare disease communities that are specifically focused on helping find undiagnosed, they tend to be much more willing to share. Or in situations like with your mother, which is, this terminal kind of situation where there's right now there's no options and it's looking really grim. You're kind of like anybody, you're out there really looking for help and trying to find an answer. I think in some cases there's an anxiety around disclosing a medical condition. Unfortunately, we still have a fair number of medical conditions that have stigma associated with them where people don't want to talk about them. I think mental health is probably the biggest area where people tend to hesitate to disclose that they may have a mental illness. I hope and I do see some of that changing, people being more open to talking about it. I think COVID actually brought it to the fore. So many people were struggling with different kinds of depression, anxiety, all of the above. And so getting people more comfortable talking about how that's affecting their ability to do their work or their ability to be successful working from home, all of those kinds of things. It's interesting. I think a good case of example here is actually in Europe, where there's a lot more restriction on data. It's much more difficult to get to and share, even than the US. I know we have HIPAA and those kinds of requirements, but it's compared to the GDPR types of rules. It's definitely more. And I think what's happening is a lot of the patient organizations themselves have started to build, to your point around volunteers, right? People saying, I want my data in this database so that hopefully if what's wrong with me can be diagnosed in the future, someone will call me and be like, we found this. We think you have this disease now. We know what it is. And oh, by the way, there's a treatment for it, and here's the treatment. Like that's what most people are really dreaming for when they share their information. I think when you couple that with things like with 23andMe having sort of gone under and then Regeneron deciding to step in and potentially take control of all of that data, that's a double-edged sword too, right? Because it's great to think about mining that data and finding patterns and taking the genomic information from clinical trials and other sources of scientific research and then applying them to a general population. But it's not entirely clear what the consents need to look like for some people may want not even want to know that they have a genetic, marker for something scary. And other people may be desperate to know and they're in the same pile of data. So how do you,
Wow.
unknow or know a thing? It's really, really tricky. So I do think that the idea of opting in and people kind of volunteering and being very aware of what it is that they have shared their information to do is super critical. And that was probably one of the challenges 23andMe faced with people weren't I know I myself did not do the 23andMe thing because I felt like it wasn't clear what the data privacy rules were. And as much as I'd love to see my data and I'd love to learn and kind of like dig into it, the
Yeah.
idea that it was that kind of available and that unprotected, I guess, in a way, was just like not something I was comfortable with. Now, if I had a disease that was, about to kill me and it was rare and I needed help, maybe you'd feel differently. Maybe you'd be much more open to sharing and not worrying so much about that. So I think it's a kind of a mixed bag there. But I think in general, people are suffering and they want help. It makes sense to me to set up a facility for them to say, please take my
Mhm.
genetic information and run it through whatever algorithms you have and try to help me figure out what's wrong. And the more that we can do those kinds of projects in this really large data sets that used to be almost like too hard to process, now they're much easier for people to look at. That was honestly when I was doing that work 20 years ago, the biggest challenge was just running the code on the data sets. If it was 10 million records, it might take 36 hours to run some of the code. And so you're waiting 3 days to see if it worked and fingers crossed nothing broke along the way. Versus now, a lot of that same stuff could probably be done in a few minutes. Like, I mean, it's just incredible how much faster the data processing has kind of like made it so that almost anything is possible in a reasonable amount of time. And so that's why it's kind of exciting because maybe that will be the way we get there. I know it's kind of a long non-answer, but my sense is that it's going to be a mix for different people for different reasons, right?
And on that note, what are you most excited about in what's available in technology and any projects that you're working on or things that you want to highlight that are really waking you up early in the morning to get started?
Yeah, I think, where AI can accelerate our ability to get work done is, and many folks I think now are starting to embrace that notion. That to me is one of my, a friend who's also a wonderful mentor of mine had said that she really wanted to get into AI. She said, what do I do? How do I get started? What should I do? And I think one of the advice I gave her and I would give most people is that AI can be really molded as you spend time with it and as you engage with it. I know you had spoken about this as well. So maybe choosing a few different of these tools right now since they're all sort of in their early stages. So for me, I often am looking at multiple tools and seeing kind of what are similar answers that I'm getting, what are different. I've used, of course, GPT like most folks have, but I've also been starting to look at Claude and Anthropic. And then also Perplexity has been an interesting additional component. And then I don't kind of know where Gemini has really jumped up as another player that I think, as Google's trying or as Facebook's trying to get involved and bring more to the table. You see these kind of each of them kind of jumping a little bit ahead. So that's my encouraging thought is to try a bunch of different AI tools and try different LLMs and see how they answer your questions. I often just take the exact same prompt, paste it into a bunch and see what I get. And I actually used this most recently for that presentation I gave about, I guess, a little over a month ago. It took me maybe 30 minutes to build the slide deck that I pretty much was right where it needed to be with those tools. And so the idea that, of course, I have an experience level and a point of view, and I had a vision for what I wanted the deck to look like. So it wasn't from absolute scratch, but the work of putting together the bullets and images and just making it something that felt really, consumable was heavily lifted by AI. And it was really exciting to see how much I could then spend time thinking about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to talk about the things I was going to do. That's really nice because I think that's the evolution people need to do. So for me, the excitement is just trying to really apply actively
Mhm.
those AI tools into my day-to-day work that I have to do and finding it almost feel like cheating, right? Because it's like, how did I normally would have taken several hours, if not a couple days, to make that content. And I did it in, literally like 20 minutes. And then I could spend time really thinking about what I wanted to talk about instead. And so that is still, to me, the way that this is going to go, right? It's going to be about getting comfortable with it, about using it, and then how much more productive, right? The rest of my afternoon's now free to go do something else. So I think that's where it's going to really start to be exciting. And this can apply across any sort of realm of project management or other just projects you're trying to get done, and whether it's a personal project or a work project. I think the personal stuff is also really great if you want recommendations for a vacation spot, or where should I go out to dinner tonight, or whatever. All of those things. It's pretty good at that now too, and so that's helpful because it saves you some time and maybe some effort on the personal front as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Shifting to a story that you shared with me when we had our conversation about, and this is not tech. I mean, it's technical in that it was a strategy you used. But tell me more about the Bell strategy that you spoke of before.
Yeah,
When you were a trainer and you
yeah,
observed in the field. Tell us about that because I think our audience would love to hear this story and what you noticed
sure.
about
Yeah.
training.
Yeah, and I think I should give some context that this is coming from one of the folks in our sales leadership group that at one point in a previous life was actually a teacher for young children, like grade school age children. So her inspiration for how to put together a training of like a new tool that was going to sit on the iPad for every rep. So this is something they're going to have to learn how to navigate and tap into different screens and to leverage the different features of this new tool. And one of the features was these notifications, and they were little red bell symbols on the iPad. So there's like the physical red bell was her idea to try to help them remember. And the same kind of adult learning and even child learning principles apply here of that memory kind of tool. So she actually bought little physical red bells that jingled and you could like shake them, and would have every time we were going through a lesson around how to use the notification feature of the tool, they had everyone had their own bell in front of them and they would pick it up and shake it. And so there's like a sound and a color and a physical manifestation of this button. And so I think it really helped cement the idea that you should look at this and use it and it's part of your workflow. And as silly and kind of maybe nonsensical as it was at the time, I felt like that whole team walked away and like, there's one thing I remember. It's like, I gotta look at the red bells and look for suggestions. And so the idea of building a next best action and engine and doing something like that with sales teams, pretty common. I think a lot of companies have either done it or done it and decided not to keep doing it, or kind of evolved. And I think that part of the reason it was sticky for this group of folks was things like that. It's not just about building a nice tool, having it work reliably, having all the data flow in and out. I mean, that's great. That's kind of table stakes. Obviously, it won't work if it doesn't work. But even if you did all of that beautifully, if you don't have those clever ways to cement the concept in, and whether it's jingling a little bell and being kind of, a little silly, but a little bit kind of just memory making, that's the way you get this stuff to actually become a habit and have it stick and have people use it over and over again. And so this team, they were working on like launching all of these tools across about 150 or so people. And the neat thing is about a year later, there's still 95% of the little red bells that show up. They click on them and they engage with them, and they either say, this is a great suggestion, I'm going to go do that, and like, well, set up a conversation, or they might say, this is a miss. This suggestion isn't going to work for me. And then there's a whole set of reasons they can pick from to say why it's not going to work. But because there's so much engagement, the feedback loop of like machine learning that's under the hood here that everyone wants, right? They want the feedback and they want to be able to put it back into the model. It works because you actually have the vast majority of the engagements have that feedback. And so then the model can actually learn from the input from the user, which seems intuitive that you can't do that unless people engage, but it turns out that's really the biggest gap. If you have, say, 5% of the suggestions are interacted with, now you're pretty, you're guessing a lot on what works and what doesn't work, because the majority of the suggestions you just don't know one way or another. And so I think that was one of the things that stuck out to me, was just that idea of really thinking about the experience of learning how to use these tools, not just building them and being like, okay, launch, this is done, everyone go use this new tool. And so to me, some of this is still human powered. And
Yep.
that's another like reminder that AI won't necessarily think of that and come up with a way to help everybody remember what to do when they see a red bell. But if you have that combination of really great technology, then maybe that person who's going to do training has the time to think of that and go to the store and buy the red bells and make sure they're ready for the training. And they wouldn't have had time to do that if they didn't use AI to kind of speed up the other work that they had to do for the day. So it's kind of this interesting interplay of kind of where you spend your energy and how you think about solving a given problem. And so if you can take some of the best examples and you look at groups that have really nailed it in your project teams and say, what are you guys doing? Like, how are you making that happen? For me, being on the ground, being able to spend time with that group of folks for a couple of days and see how it worked for them, and then taking those ideas to other places in the country and making sure that it was something we were kind of evangelizing across, that seemed like a really great way to move the needle on adoption, like genuine adoption, not just like, okay, if I have to, I'll go on the screen or whatever it is. So I think that's a big part of where technology, unfortunately now, the technology is actually pretty reliable. So the focus has to focus on the actual human use of the technology. And that's going to be the new hurdle, I think, for a lot of things that are being rolled out or given to kind of a large group of people to use.
Right, right. I agree. I agree. Understanding how to marry that human element with the technology is always the issue, right? A friend of mine always would say, it's not a technology problem, it's a human problem. It's a people problem. Um, Speaking, so shifting to your career and what you've learned and advice that you have for early professionals or anyone pivoting into this space, what advice would you offer to them based on your experiences and where you found yourself in your journey and where you're going?
Yeah, that's thank you for that. I think we talked about a few of these things over the last bit, but for me, certainly getting excited about what it is you're going to be working on is so important. So if you're not feeling pumped about what you're doing, that's not great. Like you should really, it's not that you have to follow your passion. I find that really frustrating when people say that. But if you're not mostly excited about what you're working on and you get to a point where 80-90% of the time you're kind of dreading going out to work, or you have the Sunday scaries every Sunday where you're like, oh God, I have to start working tomorrow. Like that's a signal from your body and your psyche that you need to be looking at something that is different from what you're doing. So first is just really like gauging, am I happy with what I'm doing? Am I still getting a lot of value and learning out of it, or is it dragging me down? And so that's a good gut check that you should have every so often. And especially once you tip into that, I don't know, maybe like then that's actually when you not when it's 90% problems, it should be more when it's kind of in that middle ground. I think that's one thing I've learned over the years. You should listen to that gut feel of like, I want to look at
Mm,
something new and different and it's worth considering changing it up. The other thing
absolutely.
is saying yes to opportunities. I think sometimes that's hard to do, especially when you have something that's working and you're pretty happy with it. But if you're in that, where the thing that you're looking at is more exciting to you than what you're currently doing, try to really listen to that feeling and figure out if that's what's happening. Like, what are the gaps between what you're doing today and what you want to do in the future? And can you find that pivot point? I think that's something that's really, really important to listen to as well. And that's more generic. I'm trying to keep it a little less specific to data for those two. But then I think in the data space, I mean, I'm very biased, obviously, but I think that there's so much to learn with data. It jumps across industry verticals really well. So I've hired a number of people from outside of healthcare and they've flourished and enjoyed coming over from, consumer or other industry verticals, finance, kind of even sort of the energy. I know we had someone come over that was like working in an electrical like utility provider coming over to healthcare. Really enjoyed that transition. So it's something you can move around in, which
Mm,
is nice because then you can kind of choose between the sort of matrix of the types of work you want to do and also the types of companies and places you want to do it in.
yep.
And I think it's a role for folks who I know are really prioritizing being remote or being more hybrid and a little less in the office all the time. I find it sort of an understood thing that if you're going to be a data scientist or an analytics person, a lot of that work is kind of heads down and a little bit more isolated and needs to be quiet and focused. And so I find if there's a place where there's an exception around working more remotely, that's a place where it tends to happen. So that's maybe just another tip if people are like, I really don't want to be dragging myself into the office every day. Now, I would caution that never going to the office is not great either. Like you do need to interact with people a little bit so they get to know you. But if you are in a place where you like to do your work quietly at home, I think that whole field tends to be more open to that. Because even the data scientists I was leading way before COVID worked from home a fair bit because they were kind of like, I just want to write code all day. I don't want anyone to come to my desk and ask me about something. Like just let me be home for a day. And I was like, that's fair. So I think there is some of that flexibility with that kind of a role. And then for me personally, I've been super lucky to both have the combination of really following awesome people that I like working with and looking for that as part of my next steps. I think that's been, as I've moved along and as I've gotten to know more leaders and more people, that's another compass for me is like, if I really enjoyed working with someone and they're off doing something interesting, can I see if there's a fit there? I think that's something that you can do a little more mid-career and beyond, and you start to know which leadership styles you like. And so spending that time to figure out which are the leadership types that really motivate you and get you pumped and keep you excited about work every day, and kind of gravitate toward those people maybe more so than a specific company or a specific role. And then I think the last piece is being willing to bet on yourself and take risk in your own career. And that to me is always, it's hard because you do kind of get that anxiety over doing something new. But I think if you can't bet on your own ability to get things done, then it's inner work that you need to do to get to a place where you're comfortable.
Right.
And for me, I think that's been such a great kind of headspace to be really considering options and comparing things, or, if it's something where it's a role, in a different part of the same company, do I want to make that jump? That's always like a good way to kind of filter, put your pros and cons together, things like that.
So, speaking of your compass,
Yeah.
where is Jane Urban right now? Tell us about your current season and what you're up to. We're all
Yeah, I'm super
curious.
excited. I'm a couple weeks out, so I think it's worth sharing just because it's coming soon. I'm going to be doing a startup company that's kind of in the data and AI space for biotech companies. So our clients are all going to be in this biopharma life sciences realm. And my excitement here is really the notion that if you were to start a company over from scratch with AI from the beginning, right? Thinking about AI from the very beginning, knowing what it could do and kind of leveraging it from scratch, what does that company look like? And what could that company provide in terms of services? And how much of consulting and program work is actually kind of AI-able, if you will? So can you create more formulaic services? And so we often talk about software as a service as kind of the classic idea, but what if service was the software? And what could that look like? If AI could become the service itself. And so I think that notion of that kind of flipping it over and really thinking about what is possible with AI, it's hard to do in a bigger company. And I think everyone I talk to who is in that space where they're trying to disrupt and transform with AI, they're struggling because of exactly the stuff we talked about earlier. Like, what about there's too many people who have the same skill set and I don't need as many of them? What are we going to do? How are we going to make that leap?
Right.
But if we can start over, maybe we can learn about what I'm hoping that's the biggest thing we come out of this is like what works and what doesn't from an AI perspective. So I will be the chief data and analytics officer at a little startup called Improzo. And I think it will be such an amazing adventure. I'm starting in a couple weeks, so I'm still literally haven't been onboarded yet. But the notion of what I can do next with this kind of an opportunity and hopefully help really think through a lot of different business problems and lots of project management and probably more hands-on than I have been in a while, which is going to be fun. Because there's maybe 20 people right now at the company, so it's definitely a whole different step change and scale, which I'm excited about. But that's another example of like really trying to embrace something different. And I had talked about doing a startup for years. I always thought that would be really neat, but it needed to be that right combination of the mission, the purpose, the people, the ability to drive impact, the ability to really make a difference. And I think this is checking all those boxes. So I'm super pumped to take on this next adventure. And definitely like the way that you tackle data and AI problems is going to change so dramatically over the next couple of years. So I think that's really exciting to be part of what that looks like.
Yes, and you're going to be at the forefront. So congratulations, Jane. I'm so proud to know you. And I love also that you're practicing what you're preaching here to us, that take a look at where you're going in your career and determine what's going to excite you and what you can take risks in. I love that. My last question, I see that you are a reader like me. Please, I want to encourage us all more to dig into reading and to taking that time to move away from the distractions to augment our critical thinking skills. Tell us, what are you reading or what should we be reading?
Well, there's two different things. I guess I have a whole stack of books. I'm sure people have been trying to lean in and see. But the book that's not on the screen because I'm reading it is it's a book about culture. It's called Culture by Design, and I have to confess I've only read a few pages of it so far. But this one, it's by David Friedman, and my goal here is really to think about, especially as I'm coming into a new role with a new smaller company, how do we
Mm,
design a really great culture, and where can we like sort of put some different stake posts in the ground to sort of frame up what a really great culture should look like and what it should do as a company evolves. And certainly when you have a small enough group that you can actually get everyone in one room and talk to each other, it's inherently easier to start thinking about what culture should be like. And then as you scale up, you kind of embed those things. And so many companies have done this. I think there's a lot of examples of tenants and sort of guidance. And so to me, that was something I wanted to dig into for my own kind of next journey. But I do spend a lot of time thinking about behavior and psychology because I do believe that adage that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's so true. If you don't have people who trust each other and want to work together and achieve something amazing, you're going to have a lot of trouble, even if you have a great plan or great technology. So, yeah, that's what I'm reading right now. And then I would say, like, a lot of the books that are here are all that I've really enjoyed. There's Simon Sinek in there. There's one of my other favorites is Amy Edmondson. She talks a lot about psychological safety, and she has a book called The Fearless Organization. Those are things that I've kind of keep coming back to and keep kind of skimming for thoughts and ideas. The other one that I don't know if it's on here, but there's a whole set of reading around starting a new role. So I think that's something else as I'm starting a new role. The classic one that I often go to is The First 90 Days. It's a Harvard Business Review kind of book, and it really just lays out like how do you want to tackle your first 90 days on the job. And I find that when I've read that each time I've started even a new role within the same company, I've still sat down and kind of built a 90-day plan of like, what am I going to try to accomplish in the first 90 days in this job? And even just the exercise of doing it, even if you're completely wrong, because you probably will be, but if you just put that out there as kind of a manifestation of what you want to be and what you want to do in this new kind of season of yourself, I think that's really helpful too. So those are some thoughts just in my contemporaneous space. But a lot of this is just about kind of, to your point, just continuing to grow and learn and kind of never really being done learning new things. I think that alone can take you really far in your career.
Absolutely. You are learning again how to set the weather for your new
Yes,
endeavor.
exactly.
I love it. I love it. Well, Jane, this has been fantastic. I'm so excited about your new venture. We are going to be following your journey. And how can anyone follow you? How can we follow your journey? And those of us who are interested in have you come speak, how can we contact you for those type of things?
Sure. So I do have a website that's janedataurban.com. I'm kind of running joke that data is my middle name.
Okay.
And then I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest thing to find me. And yeah, I would love to be involved in more things. And obviously with Improso coming soon, there'll be more there too. So thank you again for the opportunity. And I'm looking forward to kind of connecting with folks who are listening. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience. We look forward to having you next month on our podcast, Elevated. Thank you so much.